nothing exists in a void. Not even the notable individuals who assembled in 1787 in Philadelphia and decided, hey guys, you know what? We really should get on that whole creating a government thing. The founding fathers of the United States weren't just assembling and throwing darts at random ideas thrown up on the wall. Guys, I hit the separation of powers bullseye! Like everyone else, they had to start somewhere, with something. And like everyone else, they turned to history. They had a problem. How to create a government that would last, and not collapse into anarchy or despotism, as it was already threatening to just a few short years after the end of the American Revolution. It didn't take long for all those brilliant guys to start diving back into world history, looking for examples of other governments and how they had gone wrong. One imagines that it also didn't take long for that room in Independence Hall to start stinking something awful, given the amount of men crowded together in a non-air-conditioned room in the middle of summer, sweating through their heavy wool clothes. The founders also started to take a look at everyone who had ever asked themselves that eternal question, what is the perfect government? Turns out that a lot of fellows had asked that question over the years, and that included philosophers, politicians, and teachers in civilizations as long gone as ancient Greece or Rome. When you get that far back, and you realize that all the men are wearing what looks like the BC equivalent of bathrobes, you've truly stumbled on to the guys who pretty much wrote the book on political ideas in the classical age, which is a big name for the time when city-states, republics, and empires from Greece, Rome, and Carthage ruled most of the world, and wore robes, which is not an important fact, and yet it's so easy to keep mentioning. These originators of classical political thought are the philosophers who really got the first crack at the question of perfection in government, and the answers they came up with were varied. Going to school in ancient Athens was a little different than what you might be used to. In this case, it amounted to getting up in the morning, throwing on that robe, and walking out to a grove of trees that the Athenians held sacred to the goddess Athena. That particular grove was named after a Greek hero out of legend, Academus, and was thus known as Academia. Alongside the shaded grove was property that had been left in a will to a popular Athenian philosopher and teacher known as Plato, and it is here, at the first academy, that you have come to be schooled. Unlike modern schooling, this was in no way required of everyone. Membership, in fact, was by invitation only. Once at the academy, Plato would pose a question, and the rest of the day would be spent in pleasant contemplation, seated out under the shade of the grove, or in argument and dialogue with other scholars, with the senior members of the academy, like Plato, interjecting little comments to refine your thoughts or poke holes in your theories, and just occasionally to be little snarky know-it-alls. Plato would write down a lot of his philosophies in the form of dialogues happening at the academy, usually using as a primary character the figure of his own teacher, the legendary Socrates. It was pretty much inevitable that one day Plato and the other deep thinkers at the academy would tackle the question of perfect government. The all-around amazingness of this model of education aside, one thing you have to realize about Plato is that a lot of his theories are just that, purely theoretical, operating in a world that doesn't exist outside of Plato's imagination. Remember, this is, after all, the guy who first told stories about a continent called Atlantis that had sunk beneath the waves. Plato's Republic, a book that discusses what the philosopher thought the perfect city-state and government would include, reads like some kind of script for the greatest sci-fi movie ever made. I mean, seriously, it's just one alien invasion away from being greenlit as the perfect summer blockbuster. His perfect city-state involved a society raised from birth to fit his own idea of perfection, and involved some distinctly odd ideas. There would be no private property or possessions, with everything held in common by the people in an effort to eliminate greed and jealousy. This would actually extend to family and social life. Marriage was not allowed, and children would be taken away at birth to be raised by the city-state. Plato thought that this would eliminate a huge problem in human society, which is our tendency to cut our own family and children some pretty significant slack instead of punishing them. The elimination of nepotism aside, it was also another attempt at eliminating jealousy, which Plato was apparently not too hot on. You get the idea. The Athenian teacher wasn't particularly interested in solutions that were practical. Plato's political philosophy revolves almost entirely around the purely fantastical, operating in societies that don't exist and very likely never could exist. So, what was his idea of a perfect government, discounting for the moment the elimination of property, possession, and familial ties? Before he even got to that, he pretty accurately skewered the available kinds of governments out there. Autocracies tend to become tyrannical, oligarchies respect only money and power, and democracies become the voice of the mob, trampling on the lives of the minority. Plato didn't seem particularly enamored of any of the available choices, so being Plato, he simply pulled a fourth choice out of thin air. The philosopher king. Yeah, you heard that correctly. And no, unfortunately, this is not a comic book villain. Who is the philosopher king? Glad you asked. Basically, Plato thought autocracy actually worked fine just as long as the guy in charge was basically the perfect example of humanity. A king with energy and passion who was also a cuddly teddy bear with a sparkling personality. A philosopher who would, sit on the beach and, enjoy quiet sunsets. Around this perfect individual, Plato envisioned a whole society, divided by the virtue they possessed. Those who possessed wisdom to complete their jobs competently would spend their lives as workers, while those who possessed wisdom and the virtue of courage would serve as warriors. And at the top of the pyramid, there was the philosopher king, possessing those two virtues and one more. What was that last virtue? The one that basically elevated a person to the pinnacle of perfection? Well, for that, let's take a look at Plato's allegory of the cave, a setting the philosopher imagined in order to symbolize his views on government, virtue, and reality. It envisioned a dark cave with several people chained to a rock. A fire burns eternally behind them, casting shadows on the cave wall. According to Plato, he wanted you to envision all those people staked out as being born in the cave, knowing nothing their entire lives but the darkness and the firelight. Occasionally, a rodent would dash in front of the fire, casting its shadows on the wall, and because they could only see the shadow and not the fire or the actual rodent, the staked out people would believe that the shadow was reality. If this is starting to sound like a movie plot, well, shouldn't you expect that by now? The allegory of the cave then goes on to describe one of the staked out people being freed of his bonds, turning around for the first time to see the fire, and in that moment, having the wisdom to understand that what he has known his whole life has been a lie. Then gathering his courage, the man walks out into the sunlight, leaving the cave behind to experience the true world. Once there, the man decided that he couldn't stay and experience the truth alone without heading back to the cavern to try and convince all the other staked out people of the truth of their situation. Is it any wonder that Plato's perfect ruler would turn out in the end to be a teacher? That last virtue, which we can call a sense of justice, sets the philosopher king apart. Of course, the odds of actually finding a philosopher king out there are pretty much nil, but no one ever accused Plato of dabbling in reality. What our founding fathers could have gained from this tale, though, was a sense that the ruler of a perfect government would need to possess wisdom, courage, and a drive to do what is right. Even in his academy, Plato's focus on wibbly-wobbly realms of nonsense raised eyebrows. One of his students would go on to become a famous teacher and philosopher in his own right, and that student was not someone who subscribed to that whole ignore reality school of thought. His name was Aristotle, and just in case you didn't know, he, in turn, would have a famous student, Alexander of Macedon, better known to history as the conqueror Alexander the Great. Aristotle didn't beat around the bush when it came to the philosophical questions. A day at the Lyceum, his own version of the academy, might very well see him tackle a question like, what is the purpose of life? While other philosophers might be overwhelmed and run from the grove screaming and pulling out their hair, Aristotle hit that question head on, like an 18-wheeler with the accelerator jammed down to the floor. Everything has a purpose, he would reply. and we can judge the value of a thing by how well it serves that purpose. For instance, a knife's purpose is to cut. Therefore, a good knife is a sharp one, and a bad knife is a dull one. Right off the bat, we're enjoying Aristotle's tendency to avoid realms of impossibility. We can dig on purpose as he defines it, and that extends to what he imagined the purpose of human life to be. A human's purpose, he decided, was simply to find happiness. Aristotle doesn't just let things go at that either. Having told us that the purpose of human life is to find happiness, Aristotle goes ahead and gives us some instructions on how exactly each and every person can go about that. And amazingly, his solution takes into account all the variation and individualization the human race and its billions of lives necessitates. Ready for those super secret instructions? Turns out that Aristotle was going for simplicity here. Basically, happiness consists of avoiding either overindulgence or underindulgence, which I'm not sure is an actual word. Picture the edge of a razor, with happiness consisting of balancing along that edge and avoiding falling over the sides by either going too far or not far enough. Today, this philosophy is called the golden mean, the middle ground, or simply moderation. But Aristotle was fond of handing out examples. Courage, for instance, was the razor's edge, but too much of that same virtue became foolhardiness, and too little becomes cowardice. Aristotle's perfect government, then, would be that one that sought moderation and avoided the extremes, and allowed its citizens to do the same, about as far from Plato's philosopher king as you can get. You'll start to see a little of Aristotle's ideas on moderation reflected in our founding fathers' initial trepidation towards partisanship, faction, and political parties, and a little of Plato's three virtues for a philosopher king in the discussion of what the presidency of the United States should be. Luckily for everyone involved, the founders chose to base more of our government on political thinkers from the Age of Enlightenment, and skipped right over any thoughts involving dark caverns and philosopher kings.